Thank you.
Okay, welcome, Mike. Thank you for doing this session for us and looking
Well,
forward to it.
thank you. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for coming. Um, I'm going to be talking about something tonight which has been close to my heart for almost all my professional life. First as a social worker, then as an academic. And the pretext for doing it now is because I was involved in the production of the book that you can see on your screen there, which came out last year, and which we've managed to raise quite a lot of interest again in the Barlinnie Special Unit in Scotland. So yes, I really welcome the opportunity of talking to the Quaker Arts Network about this, and I'll try not to talk for too long so we can have a good discussion about it. But before we start showing the slides though, I'm just going to read the beginning of a book by one of the prisoners who wrote a book as a result of his experience in the unit, a man called Hugh Collins. And at the front of his book, he says this. Sorry, I should say, it almost goes without saying, Hugh Collins was once a very violent man, and his book, Autobiography of a Murderer, doesn't really begin to tell you how violent he was, but he was convicted of one murder, and that's what he served time for. And he wrote his book some years after leaving the unit. And he says, without the fundamental principles of justice which underlie a democratic society, I would most likely now be dead. I have come to respect the principles and the many people who defend them against those who would undermine them for short-term political gain. I am now released under license for the rest of my life. I have someone somewhere to thank for signing the release papers and giving me a second chance of life. I hope this book pays tribute to the many people who showed fairness, understanding, and goodwill. It wasn't an easy task for them. They include my mother, Betty Norrie, my brother Alec, stepfather Jim, my closest friend Linda McNee, my wife Caroline and her family, and various other people, ending with a prison officer, Malcolm Mackenzie, and two other prisoners, Jimmy Boyle and Larry Winters. This book would never have been written without Bill Buford, a writer, a journalist, and several other people whose names you may not know. But I thought that's a very good introduction to the essence of the transformational work that went on in the Barlinnie Special Unit. So let me tell you more. So if you could change the slide, please. So it's a bit of a parlor game, isn't it, to pick a single book that changed your life? And I have obviously read a lot of books in my time. But if I had to have my arm twisted behind my back, I would have to pick out Jimmy Boyle's book, A Sense of Freedom, this prisoner autobiography, this memoir, which came out in 1977. And I was a social worker with young offenders in London at the time, not that old, hadn't been doing it for very long. But this book was everywhere. It was much discussed in the UK media, every bit as much in the press in England and Wales as it was in Scotland, although it was a quintessentially Scottish story. And there was a huge amount of controversy about it. So there was a sense in which you couldn't miss this book. And I had, in fact, read prisoner autobiographies before. I'd read some before, but they hadn't made as much of a difference to me as this one did. Most of the book is about Jimmy Boyle's childhood and adolescence. It's not much about the Barlinnie Special Unit, but that part of it that was about his life and the ease his childhood and the ease with which he got caught up in the criminal justice system and made worse at every turn by doing so really galvanized my commitment to helping the young offenders that I was working with, made me see them differently, made me see that the stakes were a bit higher than I thought, and it made me want to get better at doing the job. But crucially, um, who was this Jimmy Boyle, and where was he when he wrote this book? What was the Barlinnie Special Unit? And before I read this book, I was interested in social work with young offenders, but I wasn't that interested in penal reform. But by getting me interested in the Barlinnie Special Unit, I got interested in penal reform, and that has been something that has stayed with me all my life to this day and presumably to next year. So next slide, please. So what was the Barlinnie Special Unit that operated between 1973 and 1994? Well, it was a therapeutic unit in D Wing of an old Victorian prison, the famous Victorian prison that dominates the east end of Glasgow skyline. It was created by a working party that came into being because the Scottish Prison Service knew it was having a problem with its most violent prisoners. Because no matter what you did to these violent prisoners, no matter how much you put them in solitary confinement, for how long, and no matter how often you beat them up, and that was understood as one of the things you had to do, they didn't change. They didn't stop being violent. And it got to the point where one side was acknowledging of the other that sooner or later somebody was going to be killed. And so this therapeutic community was set up. There'd never been one in Scotland before. The working group had a psychiatrist and a psychologist on it. It had a prison officer, a very rare man called Ken Murray, a giant of a man physically, but a very decent and compassionate trade unionist and socialist, working class background like many of the people in the prison. And when this opened in February 1973, a man called Jimmy Boyle, who was serving a life sentence for murder, was among the first 6 inmates who was sent there. Now, Jimmy Boyle was 23 years old, and he was already well known to the Scottish public through the tabloid press, who had detailed his young adult career as a violent criminal. And he was very violent. He worked for gangsters and he ran protection rackets. And his favourite instrument was a knife, never a gun. And he was tried for murder several times, and none of the convictions were made in court. There was a lot of talk about witnesses being intimidated, but finally he was convicted of a murder, which he said he didn't commit, but he wasn't going to grass on whoever it was. But anyway, in prison, Boyle was one of these people who the Scottish Prison Service found completely unmanageable. He was relentlessly violent. Now, given that the Barlinnie Special Unit became legendary because of the art that was produced there, it is one of the ironies that art wasn't designed in to the initial therapeutic regime. Yes, they were going to have very frank group discussions between the officers, among the prisoners, between the officers and the prisoners, in the tradition of penal therapeutic communities like Grendon, where some of the Scottish prison officers were sent for a rather peremptory training before they went to work in the unit. But there was no art originally, and I'll come to why the art was there in a minute. But this unit, in the first 5, 6, 7 years of its life, was hugely controversial in the Scottish media. It was loved by liberals because it was trying to prove that you could change the worst of men into something different. But it was hated by conservatives who wouldn't accept that this was a proper prison and just saw it as a means of indulging undeserving men. Why did the worst of the worst get any of the privileges? And there were privileges in the open regime in this unit. People were not locked behind cell doors. They were allowed routine visits by family and friends. They could cook their own meals. They could make their own cups of tea. They could call officers by their first names and vice versa. It was, in every sense, a liberal regime. And that just didn't go down well with a whole political constituency in Scotland. And when you talk about the Barlinnie over its 20, what the Barlinnie Special Unit over its 21 years, you do have to divide it at 1982 because Ken Murray was moved on, much to his chagrin, against his will in many respects. He was promoted against his will. And Jimmy Boyle left the unit, went into an ordinary prison for 2 years, although was given an extraordinary job mentoring young offenders. And then he finally left in 1984. Now, after these two men, among between whom a tremendous friendship had grown, a genuine, tremendous friendship had grown between them. And they really were the effective people who managed the unit on its day-to-day, week-by-week life, rather than the man who was formally appointed the governor of it. This whole series of men and sometimes women who were appointed the governors. In its second incarnation, it was never as dramatic as it was in the first instance. But for all that, arts continued, the prison staff altered, and the later generations of staff weren't as well trained in the therapeutic community ideals, and they weren't as encouraging of art as the first generation of prison officers had been. And it was, got to be honest, by about 1990, it was a rather lackluster organisation, although the spirit had not entirely died. And one of the governors who turned up tried to bring it back to life, but unsuccessfully. And although the Scottish Prison Service asked for an evaluation of the unit to decide what to do with it, and this evaluation said it is lackluster now, but once it was wonderful, and you should do everything you can to revitalise it, the Scottish Prison Service decided to close it down. So that's the background, a schematic background. Next slide, please. So why was there art in it? Well, this came about because they realised their mistake in terms of not having enough to do for the men, the first 6 men, during the day, because they couldn't spend all their time sitting around in a group having deep therapeutic discussions. And so one governor, he'd heard of a woman called Joyce Lang. Joyce Lang was a proper artist, but Scotland's first art therapist, based in Aberdeen, and she had done some work on art therapy in the Young Offender Institution. And this prison governor didn't really know anything about what it was. He just knew that she'd been there. And so he invited her to come to Barlinnie and on a Tuesday, right? And try and interest the men in art, most of whom were very skeptical of art and didn't see it as anything that related to their world. But anyway, she stuck it out. She finally interested Jimmy Boyle in some clay sculpture. And because Jimmy Boyle did it, the other prisoners were interested in doing it as well. And from that moment, art became everything to the Barlinnie Special Unit. You never have to forget that it was a therapeutic community. The talking was very important, but the art was ever present. And it is what catalyzed change in a number of the individuals, at least as much as the therapeutic discussions. And the unit became famous in the newspapers for doing art, and the Liberals thought that was wonderful, and the Conservatives thought it was awful. But because Joyce was a very capable individual, Joyce was not your average art teacher, if you like. She was trained as an art therapist. And when she saw these men really getting into sculpture and painting and drawing, she knew what to do. She knew what to do. She hadn't worked with really violent people before, but she knew how to handle it and to bring these changes to fruition, these nascent changes to fruition. Crucially, for the fate of the unit, she involved Richard DeMarco, one of the founders of the Edinburgh Festival. So you can, in 1947, so pretty old man now. He's still around, still a raconteur about many things, including the Barlinnie Special Unit. But he became hugely interested in what art was being used to do in a rehabilitative context in prison. And very quickly, he was inviting Jimmy Boyle to leave the prison and go to his gallery and meet other artists, right? Many artists started to visit the prison on the back of the publicity that Richard DeMarco helped to give it. People came from Chicago to come and do stints with the prisoners in this unit. And perhaps most crucially, DeMarco invited a man called Joseph Beuys, at that time, probably the most famous modern artist in Europe, a hugely famous and influential man who DeMarco was keen to introduce to the Scottish art scene, but also to the Barlinnie Special Unit, which Joseph Beuys got into with both hands. And Boyle learned from all of these people. These are not the sort of people that a violent young man from the Gorbals of Glasgow is likely to ever meet. But in the Barlinnie Special Unit, he did. And they all played a part in the transformation that he got into. There was a book, the first book that was ever written about the unit, on which is on the right hand side of the picture there, was actually put together by Joyce Lang and a man who ran an art gallery, a sort of a bohemian art gallery in Glasgow. And some of the work was eventually from the prisoners was eventually exhibited there. And and the book of the exhibition was produced with contributions from just about everybody connected with the unit, many of whom are not names that are well remembered now, but Jimmy Boyle was certainly one of them. Thank you. Now, the unit produced a magazine. Lots of prisons produced magazines. Even back in the 1950s and 60s, there were prisons that produced magazines, and they're collector's items in many cases these days. But the idea of having a magazine on your wing or in your section of a prison, there was nothing new or original about that. But people in the Barlinnie Special Unit had much more freedom to decide what they put in their magazine. It wasn't monitored and controlled by the prison officers or the prison governors. It was seen as a kind of creative enterprise in its own right to let the prisoners produce a magazine. Some were literate, some not so literate, but nonetheless, they managed to get 3 issues of this magazine in production in the first 6 or 7 years, I think, of the unit's history. And it contained everything. It contained autobiographical pieces, it contained fiction, it contained poetry, photographs, and drawings that the prisoners had done. And crucially, partly because the better angels of the Scottish Prison Service did want to show off the good work that was going on in the Barlinnie Special Unit. It didn't go down that well with the rest of the prison service, but nonetheless, they felt that if they showed the rest of the service what was going on, it would add to the credibility and legitimacy of the unit. But unfortunately, that backfired because a lot of other prisons and prisoners and prison governors just complained about the obvious levels of freedom that the prisoners in Barlinnie had. And it became a disruptive influence. And so the Scottish Prison Service stopped it after 3 issues. I've never seen it, but the papers that would have comprised the fourth issue do exist, but it was never put together as a magazine. So it nonetheless provided a training ground for the prisoners who wanted to write more. So next slide, please. And although Jimmy Boyle's A Sense of Freedom is, in the public imagination, the book that is most associated with the Barlinnie Special Unit, Boyle's story was told first in a play called The Hard Man. And this is because an up-and-coming playwright, an art centre manager, and a bohemian underground writer, a Scotsman, but who'd spent a lot of time working in the counterculture in London. He read about the unit, he read about the people, and he was one of the artists who got interested in it. And he figured he would like to write Jimmy Boyle's story in a play. And Boyle didn't want him to write it on his own. So when the play was finally written, which admittedly does indeed use a lot of Boyle's young life story, and a lot of his lines are in it. So it is in fact only fair that the credit is given to both of these men. This play was performed in 1977 in the Traverse Theatre in Edinburgh, a very prestigious place to show new plays in those days, and then toured Britain. And it was also the case that alongside my reading of A Sense of Freedom in 1977, pretty soon after that, it might have been in 1988, I saw this play when it was performed in London. And although I'm saying the book was everything in terms of really making me think about what I was doing, this play was incredible to watch. Absolutely incredible. It mostly focused on the violence that Boyle had experienced in prison. It explored the attitudes of the prisoners and the prison officers. It explored their mutual understanding of what poverty does to people. It's a hell of a thing to watch, right? And it has possibly, I don't know whether this would be a first, but the police in Glasgow tried to stop it being performed because they didn't want Jimmy Boyle's story. The character in the play is called Johnny Byrne, not Jimmy Boyle, but they didn't want his story told. They were unsuccessful. And one of the most interesting things that can be said about The Hard Man is that although it's only been revived once in 2011, if you look up kind of histories of drama in post-war Scotland, you will find that this play is singled out as one of the best plays ever in the last 25 years of Scottish theatre history. All right. And it is an absolutely amazing play. And for the people who saw it, it would be their first introduction to Jimmy Boyle before they read his biography. So if you want to do the slides again, thank you. So there's a sense of freedom. And it would be impossible to underestimate the significance that this book had in terms of making anyone who wanted to think about it, what is prison for and what should we be trying to do? And we should absolutely be able to rehabilitate people. Prison should be about rehabilitation. It maybe doesn't have to be as dramatic or as extreme as the Barlinnie unit seemed to people, but the Barlinnie unit, whether you liked it or not, was the living proof that really bad people, as Jimmy Boyle was understood as, could actually change for the better and actually could be articulate and eloquent about their own experience of poverty, of crime, and of changing their ways. And there isn't much in A Sense of Freedom about the Barlinnie Special Unit. Just towards the end, there is a section about it. But a few years after he was released in 1984, he published the diaries that he had kept while he had been in the unit. And they came out as The Pain of Confinement and were an equally riveting read. And they were never as well known, these diaries, as A Scent of Freedom was. But like A Scent of Freedom, they stayed in print for a long time. And between the two of them, they helped to define what you can only really call the legend of Jimmy Boyle, the man who, the violent Glasgow gangster who turned his life around via art in a therapeutic community. In 1986, I think it was, a TV Channel 4, the new Channel 4, it dramatized A Sense of Freedom. And that too was a very impressively made film, weakened by the fact that it doesn't address the unit at all. It literally ends with Boyle walking through the front door of the special unit, but it doesn't show you anything in movie form, in dramatic form, about the unit. But nonetheless, it was a very good film and it added to people's understanding of genuinely of what a violent man Jimmy Boyle had once been. It was a very violent film. And if you read into the story that you watched on screen, the fact that it was about a man who was living a very different life by the time this film was made. I remember the night after it was shown on Channel 4, there was a live studio discussion about penal reform, not just relating to Scotland, but I would never, even though this was a point in my life when I never imagined that one day I'd work in Glasgow, one day I would meet people who were associated with this unit, one day I'd kind of work with people to bring a book out about the Barlinnie Special Unit. In 1984, 1986, nothing could have been further from my mind. But I did watch this discussion, this live studio discussion, the night after A Sense of Freedom had been shown. And to this day, it remains vivid because Ken Murray, this wonderful prison officer, went head to head with the head of the Scottish Prison Service, the head of the Scottish Prison Officers Union, with whom he had fallen out badly. because the head of the Prison Officers Union was a stern Calvinist who believed that violent men had to be repressed and allowed no expressions of personal creativity whatsoever. And it was as dramatic in its own way to watch that confrontation, which I think Ken Murray won the argument, as it was to have watched A Sense of Freedom itself. So, in that sense, the movie A Sense of Freedom facilitated a fantastic discussion about what the special unit was trying to achieve, and indeed what it had achieved. Next one, please. But Jimmy Boyle was not the only person to leave the special unit and write a wonderful book. Boyle wrote his book while he was still in prison, actually. Hugh Collins waited until after he'd been released in 1994 before he wrote Autobiography of a Murderer, the book that I read from at the very beginning. Sadly, unlike Jimmy Boyle, who is alive and kicking at 80, Hugh Collins died in 2021, which was very sad, only aged 70. And he died alone and sad, but he'd never gone back to crime. He'd never gone back to crime. And he too had something of an artistic career. He married an artist, and that helped. And he spent a lot of time tutoring young people about art. Jimmy Boyle married a psychotherapist and had a completely different kind of affluent life in Edinburgh after he left the prison. But Hugh Collins's life wasn't like that. But he took the writing part seriously. In prison, he liked sculpting, he liked drawing, but it was only afterwards that he got into writing. And this book, although it's not as famous as A Sense of Freedom, and one reason for that is that, unlike A Sense of Freedom, which has never been out of print, Hugh Collins got one shot at publication, and this book has never been in print since 1997. But in its own way, it is just as good as Jimmy Boyle's. It's a very different kind of book, very different interpretation of what was the same experience in Barlinnie for both men. But it is a phenomenal read, and it is fundamentally about violence, about why it occurs, what it's like to commit it, what it feels like afterwards. And he finds the words to convince you of what that is like for people who grew up like him. Next slide, please. But even Hugh Collins and Jimmy Boyle don't entirely exhaust the literary contributions that came out of the Barlinnie Special Unit. Even this slide doesn't exhaust it either. In the middle is a novel that Jimmy Boyle wrote some years well into his release, Hero of the Underworld. It's a very strange novel. It's a kind of phantasmagoric novel. It probably owes something to Kafka and certainly a little bit to Dostoevsky, who Boyle read in prison. He read Crime and Punishment when he was in prison. It's mostly based on people he knew in something called the Gateway Exchange, which he and his wife set up after he left prison and tried to create a Barlinnie Special Unit in the community for released prisoners. And they set this up on the cusp of the AIDS crisis in Edinburgh, and it morphed into a project that dealt with drug users who had HIV. And the Gateway Trust still exists in today as a kind of funding organisation for arts projects, and the royalties from our book on Barlinnie do go to the Gateway Trust. On the right-hand side of the picture is the sequel, the second memoir that Hugh Collins wrote called Walking Away. And he also wrote two novels, two crime novels set in Glasgow, which were a thinly disguised drama of how heroin came to Glasgow and altered the gangster landscape. This is something that he knew firsthand. So he renames all the actual characters as somebody else. He alters some of the incidents that were crucial to the development of the drug trade in Glasgow. And he was going to write it was going to be a trilogy, but we never know. We've never found out why there isn't the third volume, and none of these books have ever been in print more than once. And that's a shame because Walking Away is a very good complement to Autobiography of a Murderer. And the novels are pretty good crime novels with a certain added something because you know that they're written not by a professional crime writer, but by a man who is living through some of these experiences. On the right, there is a collection of poetry and writing called The Silent Scream by another of the unit prisoners, another of the original six, a man called Larry Winters. Larry Winters was also serving a sentence for murder. He was also a very heavy drug user, and he died of a drug overdose, probably with drugs that had been smuggled into the unit for him, and never went through the kind of transformational processes that other people in the unit did go through. Now, The Silent Scream was also turned into a film, um, which in certain kind of movie buff circles is regarded as an even better film than A Scent of Freedom, possibly because it does contain some elements of the Barlinnie Special Unit within it. It begins in the unit, and although Larry Winters, the lead character, is center stage, there's somebody playing Ken Murray, there's somebody playing Jimmy Boyle in the background, and it's not much talked about now. But if you look along the top of the little photograph of the film at the bottom, you can see all the awards that it won at international film festivals. So the story of the Barlinnie unit and the people in it got told through more movies, more books and movies than I think has ever been the case with any other prison that I've ever heard of, certainly in the United Kingdom. Next slide. So, prison writing. There's a lot to be said about it, and I hope we can discuss lots about it. So everybody will say, well, how do we know these are true stories? Aren't they just making it up to sound that they've changed more than they have changed? And if a prisoner writes a book, I mean, in what sense are they typical of people who go to prison? Because most people who go to prison don't write books. So that gets talked about. Most serious prison memoirs, and there are an awful lot of unserious prison memoirs these days as well, they are redemption stories, but there's two sides to that. They might be saying that they are redeemed characters because of the system or despite the system, or in the case of Hugh Collins, a bit of both. Right? They have very different takes on personal change. So they don't have consistently similar understandings of change. So, note in some ways, a book set in a prison is obviously going to resemble another book set in a prison. But I would say, having read a lot of them now, that no two prison memoirs are alike. They are often of transient public interest, and Hugh Collins's book is the ultimate in transience. But A Scent of Freedom is unique in the UK for remaining in print almost continuously. I think there was a 4 year period when the paperback was not available, and then it was brought out by somebody else other than the original publishers, and is still around now. Books like this manifestly influence public debate in a way that official reports, inspectorate reports, and academic research projects don't do, right? It means that you tend to focus on a series of specifics as raised by that book and the lessons you can generalize from it. So there isn't the patina of objectivity that you might get with an official or an academic report. But what you lose in that sense, you gain in the power of lived experience. Now, nowadays, you can't move in the mainstream media or social media for things called true crime, right? The world is fascinated by true crime. It commands huge audiences. And true crime does contain some serious productions, some serious books, some serious TV programs, but mostly it involves telling gruesome and grotesque stories, emphasizing victimhood as much as anything else. And if it's talking about bad characters, it either celebrates them as bad characters, or it gets very moralistic and just denounces them and makes no effort whatsoever to understand them. And there's plenty of that stuff on mainstream television. You don't have to go to any obscure part of social media to find material like that. And lots of gangsters, like Hugh Collins and Jimmy Boyle were, lots of gangsters have written memoirs, but a lot of them in the last 20 years have basically been, I really enjoyed what I did. I was pretty successful at it. I made a lot of money. And then I decided, got a wife, got kids, don't want to go back to prison, so now I run a garage, I run a restaurant. And there's no soul searching in these books. They may have gone to prison, but basically they are telling you that they had a good life and that they got away with it, really. And they're not ruined. This was just for, I know some of you are interested in creative writing schemes in prison. So that's just a reference to an article in prison about an article about creative writing in prisons. So that's it. That's it. There you are. Okay, we can leave that one. Thank you very much. All through emails. And if you want to buy the book, you know where to find it. But I hope we can now have a very interesting discussion among ourselves.
Could I, my name's Jemima, by the way. Could I ask how many people were in the unit at any one time?
A very good question. Not many. 9 was probably the highest they ever had in there at any one time. And only 30 people passed through it in its 21-year history.
Right.
So,
Because,
yes, it was very expensive. It would not go down well with a bean counting cost effectiveness expert.
no.
But that depends on what you mean by effectiveness in a sense. But
Yeah.
it was a small unit in every sense of the term. And it
Yeah.
didn't have that many people going through it.
I currently write to two men on death row in America, and I feel that the art of writing and communication is very important, and that letter writing is an easy way into writing, because it's got a structure and you're addressing somebody else. But I know that in Texas, they are beginning to open up and give the prisoners recreation time together rather than being locked up for 23 hours a day. Um, do you think that letter writing is a form of um, therapy for any of these men?
I certainly think so. I mean, I'm presuming that you know our friend Jan Arians, who
Yes,
played a big
yes.
part in enabling friends and other people to become letter writers to people on death row. No, I think all of that is a wonderful enterprise, something which Jan can be very proud of having made that happen. And yes, I mean, I think there is plenty of evidence that it does have a therapeutic effect to have that link with people outside, even in another country. I mean, many of these people would go on to death row, never even imagining that one day they might correspond with somebody in England or Scotland. So I think that it does, it helps. Whether, I mean, you have to be careful about defending this too far because it changes very little in the harsh reality of their day-to-day lives, and some of them will still get executed. But as a way of alleviating the pains of confinement for people who are experiencing the worst kind of confinement in many respects, because death row is a very Spartan environment most of the time. And yes, this is redemptive work. This is helpful work. But I would still want to make a case to do a lot more about the conditions on which people serve on death row. And ideally, we wouldn't have death rows.
Thank you.
Leslie,
Hello, Mike. Thank you for your presentation. Do you know how many hours a day would was given over to artistic ventures as opposed to psychiatry, therapy, psychology?
No, I don't think you can put a number on that because they were free to do it whenever they liked. The prison became more like a studio than a prison. I mean, it was recognizably a prison wing, but there were murals on the wall. There was a courtyard outside where the big sculptures were made, and people could just go in and out and work whenever they wanted to. Um, so there was a certain time of the week when they had to have this kind of marathon therapy session, and there were other occasions when incidents occurred, incidents between prisoners, incidents between prisoners and staff, when emergency meetings were convened. And if there were changes of policy, like in the later years when the main governor of the Barlinnie prison wasn't all that bothered about the specialness of the special unit, and he decided he was going to introduce drug dogs into the prison to sniff out drugs, and that was going to happen in the special unit as well. And you could say there was cause for that, given the circumstances under which Larry Winters had died, but there had never been drug dogs in the special unit before, and so they convened a huge meeting among the prisoners to decide whether this was acceptable or legitimate. And they just argued it out. And the man who was the governor at the time, who contributes to our book on Barlinnie, talks about how that went and how long it took to get to an acceptance of the drug dogs coming in. So the therapeutic, what a psychiatrist might call the therapeutic element was within the first 2 or 3 years so entwined with the art therapy that you couldn't really separate them or put hours on it. I mean, there were certain, minimal hours about group discussion with extra times, but once the art got underway, people could just go to their cells and write or draw or go out in the courtyard and sculpt or paint. And obviously there were arguments about, allowing hammers and chisels into prisons because that was a bit new. There had never really been anywhere in a Scottish prison where the prisoners were freely given hammers and chisels. Um, but no, there weren't set hours for doing activities.
Mm, thank you.
Alice, you're muted, Alice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just wondering why and how Grendon has survived so long when it's a therapeutic and presumably very expensive prison, and Barlinnie failed, having been
Yes.
so successful.
Yeah. I mean, that is a very good question. And that's a very good question. Um, and I don't know that anybody has. I mean, there is a history of Brendan quite a long time ago now. There is a proper academic book about Brendan as a prison. Like a number of English prisons have had whole academic reports written about them. To this day, there has never been a book like that about Barlinnie, about the Barlinnie Special Unit. And the Special Unit is known uniquely more by what prisoners wrote about it and what an art therapist wrote about it than what an academic prisons researcher wrote about it. But the book on Grendon um, it only tells you the story so far. My interpretation of what these two similar institutions, although Grendon is much bigger and always has been much bigger, why Grendon has survived. Grendon was never high profile. Grendon never attracted the kind of publicity that was attracted by the Barlinnie Special Unit. And you never got the polarizing opinion about it that you got in relation to Barlinnie Special Unit. Also, art, while there is art therapy in Grendon, and there is some very effective art therapy going on there now. So our friend Marion Liebman tells me. But art was never as big a deal in Grendon And probably the regime was never quite as relaxed as the one in the Barlinnie Special Unit, where basically visitors could turn up whenever they liked. Grendon was never full of artists of every description, sometimes turning up from Chicago to become part of the educational and artistic regime. Grendon had a much bigger team of therapeutic staff to engage in different forms of psychotherapy with individuals. And there was an individual element, an individual counseling element, if you like, an individual psychiatric element in prison in Barlinnie, people who wanted it. But that never figured very prominently. The therapy was done much more through groups than it was through individuals. Crucially about Grendon, and this is one of the oddities about Grendon, is that British politicians, England and Wales politicians, never talk about Grendon. It's almost as if they're embarrassed by it. They love to talk up building bigger prisons. They love to talk up making regimes more punitive. They love to talk about that. They never tell you, but by the way, we've got this really successful prison in Buckinghamshire. They just let it go. They just let it go on doing what it does. They keep appointing very decent and skilled men as governors and staff. They're very open to Quaker prison ministers. And I think Grendon has survived ultimately because it has managed to keep a low profile. And that has been aided by the government themselves, who just don't talk about it. To most of the recent crop of justice secretaries, it is as if Grendon doesn't exist.
Interesting.
And that has enabled it to survive.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Quite a long time ago now, but in the days when I was a Quaker prison minister, I had the opportunity to spend a day in Grendon. And I was very impressed by it, I must say. We talk freely with some of the prisoners and so on, and they had a kind of sense of pride in the place.
Yeah,
they felt that they said, it's pretty tough what's expected of us here, but nevertheless, we, in a way, we kind of respect what's going on. It's very impressive, I must say. Yeah.
it is. I mean, I did one of those open days as well. If I at a different time,
we did the same one. It could be.
maybe. I mean, I was a social worker the first time I did it, and I was an academic the second time I did it. Some years in between, and yeah, I mean, how could anybody not be impressed with what goes on in Grendon? But it's a much more organized regime than was ever the case in Barlinnie. There was an element of kind of controlled chaos and sometimes not so controlled chaos in the Barlinnie Special Unit. And, if I had to have my arm twisted behind my back again, I would probably say it is difficult to sustain a prison that was run the way that Grendon was run, with, a charismatic prisoner and a charismatic prison officer basically running the show because everybody else would do what these two men said. It probably isn't possible to sustain that for a long time. But for people who say, and it should never have been done, I still want to say, look at the amazing results that you got out of this controlled chaos. And there has to be some learning for everybody about how to work with violent men from that admittedly chaotic experience.
Yeah.
John.
Yes. I want to change the focus slightly. I'm visiting two prisoners at the moment. One of them is serving a life sentence in a privately run prison. I'll call him Jay. And the other is a prisoner on remand for a sexual assault in Birmingham local prison, Winson Green. And Jay, in the private prison, is an educated man, a trained accountant. He'll be in prison if he serves his term at least till into the 1930s. He spends a lot of his time studying. He's in a prison with marvelously equipped workshops, the wood workshop there, which I've been around, is quite incredibly good and sells masses of stuff out into the community. And Jay is whatever the equivalent of a Samaritan within the prison is, and so on. He's a nice guy to meet and talk to, although his crime was pretty appalling. And he's got a lot going for him. Brian in Winston Green is a very inarticulate man. It's quite difficult to have conversations with him when you meet him, because he'll ask you a question and you'll answer it, and he doesn't really know where to go from there. Although he's probably within the normal range, he must be fairly low in intelligence within the normal percentages. He has very few resources how to spend his time. I've given him books occasionally, but I'm pretty sure he never reads them. Now, in a sense, I mean, Jay isn't sort of a typical Barlinnie candidate or anything like that. But he's a man, it's a pleasure to help. So my worry is talking about writing about self-expression, about learning the language of the feelings. Brian's the one who needs help, but how does one do
it? Yes, I mean that is all a good question, and you know I'll come back to as direct an answer as I can give that. But I'll start by saying, yeah, we want people to talk about the Barlinnie Special Unit. That's what we put the book together for. But it's not because we're saying that the Barlinnie Special Unit is the answer to all the problems in the penal system. It was absolutely an answer to the problem of violent gangsters in Glasgow. It was absolutely the answer to that. But you wouldn't be able to get away with a unit like that just for people who had committed serious sex offences, for example. But it's interesting what you say about Brian's inarticulacy, because, again, unlike Grendon, where prisoners have to apply to go to Grendon and have to have a certain level of articulacy and insight before they are allowed to go to the programme, the people who went to the Barlinnie Special Unit were not given a choice. I mean, they could fight to resist if they wanted to, but they weren't given a choice. They were told they had to go. They weren't assessed for anything in particular. And the only reason they were sent there is because they were represented the most violent problems being faced by the Scottish prison system. And some of those men were inarticulate. They were not picked, unlike the people who go to Grendon, for their articulacy. And many of them, probably all the original 6, would have met no one's definition of a nice, likable person, right? Which makes what Joyce Lang managed to do with them even more remarkable, right? So allowing for the fact that the Barlinnie Special Unit, in the way it was run, is not a model for solving all the kind of problems that people in prison present to the authorities, what it does prove is that it's worth making the effort to find out what makes people tick. And we could probably do that with someone like Brian. It might take a lot of time and effort to do it. You wouldn't want Brian, I would imagine, in a wing where he would easily be exploited by other people. And I hope that issue has been addressed in whatever he's facing in which prison? He's in Winston Green, isn't he? He's on remand in Winston Green, yeah. So I think there are prisons that would claim to have units for vulnerable people, vulnerable in the broader sense of emotionally and intellectually vulnerable, rather than vulnerable prisoners in the sense of being sex offenders who other prisoners would want to assault. But I have heard of units where people make the effort with prisoners like Brian. Whether that would be considered a luxury in the prisons we have nowadays, where there is such pressure on so many aspects of prison officers' work, that if a man wasn't causing a lot of trouble in prison, would he get the kind of attention that would help him with whatever issues he needed to address in prison? Does that go somewhere towards an answer?
Well, unfortunately, it raises the sort of the next question, which is, if Brian could be helped to think more clearly, it might be good for society because it might prevent him blundering into trouble again. And from what I know of his current case, I think he's probably not guilty technically, but it's linked to the fact that he can't see what's coming at him.
No, but he's on remand, and the opportunities for people on remand are much less than for sentenced prisoners, right?
That's true.
So you know, if the person is kind of innocent till proven guilty, we tend not to offer them the kind of resources that help them to survive. And because they can be on remand for such a long time, that is definitely a bad thing. And the reason they're on remand for such a long time is hardly their own fault. It's just to do with the backlog of cases in the courts. But there is a problem about working with people on remand when there aren't even the resources to work properly with people who are sentenced. And there is a lot of neglect going on for people in remand. I mean, would you say that Brian actually needs to be on remand? I mean, if he was out in the community on an electronic tag, does he have a place to go to?
Well, two things. First of all, I haven't said, because it wasn't relevant before, but it's perhaps now, Brian's an ex-prisoner, and I first met him in prison when he was under sentence for something, well, for another offence that wasn't too different, perhaps. But sorry, just put your question again, Mike, and after that I'll step aside to someone else.
Well, I mean, given that being on remand is a pretty difficult experience
Yeah.
for people like Brian these days, because the prison is not empowered to support them. And so, the question then follows is, does this person really need to be on remand
Yeah.
in order to protect society from them? Or if they were on an electronic tag, subject to some kind of supervisory regime and linked into a bail support service, all of these things are quite hard to do. The electronic monitoring, not so much, but the bail support, probably quite a lot. But I mean, does Brian really need to be remanded in custody?
Well, given that his first sentence 15 or 20 years ago was for a sexually linked offence, and he's now being accused by someone of another sexual assault, I can't imagine them giving him bail.
No, you're right. For the threshold for the use of custody with any kind of sexual offence is very low now. That is true. That is true.
I mean, it's as I say, I'll shut up now. But I can say I visited him often during the 2 or 3 years that he was out, and he was getting practically zero support.
Yeah, well, and that's also true. On the outside, the support from the probation service has collapsed. It has. It's easier to monitor than support now. Yeah. Thank you, John. Annika.
Yes, thank you, Mike. I would be interested to know what your opinion is about the way that first the groups were formed in a therapeutic sense, with listening and talking to each other through the whole of the prison. So with prison staff, with everybody who was there in Barlinnie unit, no matter what work you were doing. I think that was the kind of philosophy of it, and was that compulsory in the beginning of time? And would you think that the art part of the life would that have been successful as well, or would have been a balance in their expression of it if that wouldn't have been there so much, or if that would have been, free to go for prison for everybody? How has that worked out? Was that an idea of the balance of it, and one wouldn't go without the other? as the art part was very much advanced in its time, wasn't it?
Yeah, very, very much so. Well, I mean, that's a fair question because the first generation, that those first six people, only one of that first six became famous, Jimmy Boyle, but the other five people did all throw themselves into doing art because Jimmy threw himself into it. So they all did it. And after the horrors they had experienced in the earlier part of the prison system, when they had experienced solitary confinement, been beaten up, just the long, slow drag of time, they did leap at the opportunity at the degree of freedom and creativity that they were offered. Now, as time went by and some people left and some new people came in, it is true that not all the prisoners were equally interested in art. They all had the opportunity to do something, and as far as I know, in the first 10 years, everybody did something. But it is true that not all of them wanted to do that. And it may well be that some of them, if you could talk to them, would say they found the therapeutic aspect of it more valuable than the arts aspect of it. Because there was individual opportunities to talk to a psychiatrist or a psychologist about the issues that preoccupied you, if you wanted them. And that's a rather unsung aspect of the story of Barlinnie. I think that the group dimension of the discussions, there are so many stories about the electric atmosphere of those group discussions that I think it's pretty clear that they must have been very powerful change agents. But what about the people who didn't take it all that seriously? In the second half of the unit's life, if you went there because you were considered a problem in the rest of the prison system, in the second half of the unit's life, the officers just stopped pressing you to get interested in art at all. You could stay in your cell and read a book or read a newspaper. You still had a lot more freedom than you would have had if you'd have still been in the mainstream prison system. But people were kind of giving up on the idea that art would help you. And without the galvanizing effect of Jimmy Boyle, there was less of an incentive for other prisoners to take it up. You can't really underestimate the impact of Jimmy Boyle on persuading other prisoners to do this. Hugh Collins overlapped with both. He was there in the first 10 years, but he was still there in the unit after Jimmy Boyle had left. But Hugh Collins kept himself to himself. He didn't really have he didn't take on to himself the mentoring role that Jimmy Boyle took on. So even in the latter part of Hugh Collins' time there, other prisoners were just drifting away from it, right? So art wasn't everything. But what we do know, because the psychologist who worked in the unit did a proper academic official evaluation of the people who went through the unit. And, we do have the facts, the figures, and the statistics that everybody who went through the Barlinnie Special Unit became less violent than they had been. Everybody, right? So at the straightforward level of, what did the prison want to make people less violent so they could go back into the mainstream prison system and not cause as much trouble as they'd done before, that aim was succeeded. That aim was achieved. But so much more was achieved that had never been imagined. And the bit that was achieved that had never been imagined was done through the art, above and beyond the therapeutic stuff. And Jimmy Boyle himself would be the first to say, and in the 2016 edition of A Sense of Freedom, which has got an extra afterword in it, he spells that out, and he says that it was the talking. We'd never done art before, but we were not the sort of people who ever sat round in groups and discussed our problems with strangers. And he said that made all the difference. And, Jimmy Boyle is an incredibly articulate and eloquent man now. I mean, he's had the far greater chunk of his life. He's been a law-abiding citizen than he ever was a criminal. But he is a very eloquent man now. He can talk non-stop about all sorts of penally related subjects with as much intelligence as any academic. or art. And to be honest, he talks more about art now than he talks about prisons and penal issues. But that intelligence in the man had been completely missed by the schools that he went through. You know, as he says in the book, his father was a known criminal, and so he turned up at school, and all he got was, "I knew your father," right? And nobody expected Jimmy Boyle to be any different to what the people in his community or the kind of family that he came from. Nobody ever expected him to be different. So that was a roundabout answer to your question. I think you were asking me something about the prison officers as well, because their twos is a very interesting story. Nobody wanted to go and work in this new special unit, this psychiatric unit, this unit which was going to help the bad characters who had beaten up their colleagues. Nobody wanted to go and work in it. So they had to give them a financial incentive to get 12 people to become the members of staff, right? And one of those men was a man called David Croft, who also writes a chapter in the book. And I always get emotional when I talk about David Croft, because I met David quite soon after I'd come to Scotland, in the context where I didn't know that he had been in the Barlinnie Special Unit. I met him, I was told he was a retired prison governor, but in the course of the conversation, it turned out he had been one of the first officers, right? And he said to me, it always gets to me, he said, "Mike, when they created the Barlinnie Special Unit, it was to change the prisoners. They never realized that it would change us as well." Now, how powerful is that? How powerful is that? And then he said, "I would never have formed the ambition to become a prison governor if I hadn't have been a prison officer in the Barlinnie Special Unit." And by all accounts, he was a tremendous prison governor, a tremendous man, right? So other people, apart from the prisoners, got changed by this experience. Quite by chance, just recently, within the last 3 months, I discovered that a person I know in Glasgow local meeting, who was also a social worker in Scotland, she knew David Croft when he was a prison officer. And I never realized that until recently, until the book kind of created the opportunity to have that conversation. So she's added to my knowledge of David Croft as a prison officer after he had been in the unit, before he became a governor, which add to my sense of what a wonderful man he was. And on his own account, he would not be the man he became had he not worked in the Barlinnie Special Unit. So we're going to do another talk about the book and the Barlinnie Special Unit in Glasgow at the beginning of next month at a place called the Galgale Trust, which is one of our members in Glasgow meeting, a man called Alistair McIntosh. You might have heard of Alistair McIntosh before. The Galgale community is an organisation in a very poor community in Govan in Glasgow. It is in its own way a very legendary community project, which has helped many people through mental health crises and difficult times, including ex-prisoners, right? And to advertise this event, Alistair took out his phone in the community one day, and he was talking to this old guy, a former prisoner, and saying we were going to do a talk about the Barlinnie Special Unit. And he said, he told him a little bit about it, and he said, what do you think of that? What do you think of that? And so the guy sounds like a good idea. And then Alistair said to him, what do you think is driving people into prison nowadays then? Why do people commit these crimes? And the guy just talked about poverty and lack of opportunity and labeling, been experienced as somebody who is outside society, not having all the opportunities at school that he might have had. This is in August in 2025, and yet some of it sounded just like the pages of Jimmy Boyle's book in 1977, talking about his childhood in the 1950s. And in that sense, it's dispiriting because it's not just the prison system that didn't learn the lessons of the Barlinnie Special Unit, and it didn't learn that many of them. But we've done next to nothing in Scotland, and maybe this would be true of England and Wales as well, to address any of the factors that drive young men in poor communities into violent crime, into organised crime. We've done very little. And Boyle talks about that. In some respects, Jimmy Boyle is very despondent. This is maybe why he talks more about art than prisons now. Because I guess with art you can sometimes talk about progress and development in the careers of artists. But he is completely despondent about the likelihood of the Scottish government ever learning what it needs to do to reduce crime and properly rehabilitate people. And at 80, one cannot help but be proud of him for the lessons that travel in him, admiration for the success that he's achieved and the time he put in to spreading the word. But it is kind of sad to hear him be so despondent about the future. Having lived through something which pointed to much better times, he no longer thinks those better times are possible. So at least in Scotland, for all that Jimmy Boyle is still very despondent, we could not have wished for a better response to the book in Scotland. We never tried to publicise it as much in England, but we publicised it a lot in Scotland, and we got a very good response to it. And there is an appetite for talking about it, for the lessons that you can learn about what to do with violent men from poor backgrounds. It doesn't really address questions more widely than that. But we find in Scotland that there is a readiness to insist that that is what we should be doing. And of course, the one thing that maybe one shouldn't be quite so despondent about is there is a lot more art in prison than there used to be. Art in prison never really took off until Arthur Koestler, journalist, political activist, founded his trust in England, in London in the 1960s. Very low profile in its first 10 years. But after the Barlinnie Special Unit gave a lot of publicity to the potential of art in prison, people seem to take the Koestler Trust more seriously. And nowadays, the Koestler Trust is a kind of byword for the use of art and creativity with sentenced prisoners. And there is a network of artists who work in prisons who have been around for a long time. I've never been part of it myself, don't know much about it firsthand. But, would there have been this artistic network had the Barlinnie Special Unit not been so spectacularly successful at using art? Joyce Lang gave her last interview to us before she died when we were writing this book. She was 90 something. She never wanted to tell people how old she was, but she was 90 something and pretty indefatigable even at 90. And we're hoping that there is going to be a Joyce Lang memorial lecture, because there's never been in Britain a memorial lecture to an art therapist. And Joyce was a remarkable woman in so many ways that it seems entirely fitting that she is the art therapist who gets the first memorial lecture to that profession, because she had a pretty successful career going as an art therapist, working with clients, writing articles in psychiatric journals before she became the person she became in Barlinnie. And you could not, diminish her role. Everything at the beginning depended on her. If she'd have panicked at the thought of seeing these men go wild about art, which is kind of how it was, if she'd have thought that was too much, it all might have been different. But she handled it brilliantly. And Boyle has never denied the credit that she is owed for what he did with the rest of his life. But after Barlinnie closed down, she stayed with it almost to the end, But she then went and ran a gallery in her hometown of Pittenweem to outsider art. So sometimes that is art produced by prisoners. Sometimes it is art produced by people with mental health issues, people who are recovering from addiction issues, and so on. And the only way that we've managed to memorialize the Barlinnie Special Unit up to now is that there is a big vitrine in Kelvin Grove Museum, huge big museum in Glasgow, which has a section devoted to outsider art. And in some of that collection in the Kelvin Grove Museum, there is some art from the Barlinnie Special Unit, but we've never managed to get the special unit memorialized in its own right, despite its uniqueness and its unique success. But we're working on it. We're working on it.
Thank you very much, Mike. Oh, is there some more questions? Yep, go for it.
It's not a question, it's just an observation that you've talked about some remarkable people who had the good fortune to meet some remarkable people.
Yes, I mean, that's true. That is a good way to sum it up, right? There was a very fortuitous set of circumstances. Ken Murray was an exceptional prison officer. Without realizing it, Joyce Lang was a much more exceptional art therapist than she'd ever known before she stepped into the Barlinnie Special Unit. And people like Joseph Boyce, who, really could have busied himself with the highest levels of the European art scene, came down to the Barlinnie level and went on hunger strike to stop Jimmy Boyle being transferred back to an ordinary prison where he would probably not have thrived after what he'd achieved in the unit. How many prisoners, how many men from the Gorbals have ever had one of Europe's greatest artists standing up for them like that? So yes, that's exactly right. This was a fortuitous set of circumstances, and we do think that it's the lessons of that fortuitous set of circumstances that we never want to be forgotten. And I got that about Boyle before I was a Quaker, because I really did think when I was working with these young offenders in London, I'm thinking if a man as bad as Boyle can actually change, then the work I'm doing with you really is worth it. I should really put myself out to create different opportunities for you. That is exactly what I thought. But I didn't know the phrase that of God in everyone at that point in time. So there is definitely some Quaker lessons traveling in the work of the Barlinnie Special Unit, although I wouldn't have understood them that way when I first encountered it. But I was inspired by it all the same. And it's true, if people like Hugh Collins and Jimmy Boyle can change, then probably anybody can. It's just a question of finding the people with the skills who can do that. And ideally, you need a prison system with an appetite for encouraging it, because that makes the difference as well. Notwithstanding the fact that Grendon has survived, that's just an anomaly. It's very hard to explain that Grendon has survived in a penal system that is becoming steadily more punitive, under-resourced, harder to work in. But Grendon is still there, and long may it continue. But in Scotland, there is no appetite for doing anything similar to it, even though we are starting to use solitary confinement for recalcitrant prisoners on the same scale that we used it in the 1970s. And even a European human rights organization is taking Scotland to task for its use of solitary confinement. So the sense of déjà vu about these things is, again, there is cause for despondency if we weren't by temperament and faith such hopeful people, which we are, aren't we? So, is that a good note to end on, Amanda?
Yeah, I think so. That was very, very, very good, Mike. Thank you so much. And thank you, friends, for coming along and enjoying Mike's talk. I'll stop the recording now.